It's 9 o'clock, so let's get started. This meme recently emerged. It's outdated already. It's November, right? And I think it illustrates things fairly well. The first thing, of course, it illustrates is that the younger lady says to the older one, presumably a grandmother, that this is entirely your fault. And this highlights the intergenerational nature of climate change, right? The grandma highlights one of the issues of climate change, that it's warmer than it used to be. And it also highlights one of the things that is actually important, particularly important for today, that the granddaughter blames the grandmother. Whereas most people would say October, until it got wet, was actually fairly pleasant, right? The question whether climate change is good or bad is the subject of today's lecture and the two that follow. I'm going to talk about a number of things. I'm going to talk about 6 impacts of climate change. I'm going to take you through the mostly biology of this. There's a little bit of physics as well. But I'm also going to talk about the human aspect and the social aspect and the economic aspects of this. And this is the opening of a series of 3 lectures, 3 weeks. It keeps on doing this. So we started by talking about the science of climate change scenarios and technical options of greenhouse gas emission reduction. Then over the last 2 weeks, Diego has taken you through what you can do as a policymaker about these emissions and what it would cost. Now what we're going to do over the next 3 weeks is answer the question, why do we care about climate change? Why do we consider this to be a problem that needs to be solved, right? And then the final 3 weeks is actually about putting the costs of climate policy together with its benefits, that is the avoided impacts of climate change, in a cost-benefit analysis and all the bells and whistles that come with that. But today I'm going to mostly focus on what will climate change actually do to us. And then next week, Diego will answer the question, how bad is this really from a human welfare perspective? I'm going to start by talking about the impacts of climate change for nature. Now, guess most of you have traveled, and being in England, most of you will have traveled south for the holidays, right? And if you just get into a plane and then get off the plane in Spain or in Italy, you notice that the landscape is different and the plants are different, right? If you drive south, which I would recommend because it is actually eye-opening, that you see slowly changing vegetation as you drive into a different Mediterranean climate. And if that's true spatially, then it must also be true over time, that if climate change leads to warming, higher temperatures, leads to different rainfall, then you would expect to see a different plants, and those plants that are not directly affected by temperature and rainfall would still be affected by the competition with other plants, right? And of course, if you affect plant life, then you also affect anything that feeds on those plants. So you would also expect to see different insects, different animals, and so on and so forth, right? So this just stands to reason that this is what you would expect. And those impacts can be quite large. What you're looking at here is a rather awful picture from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's latest, the 6th assessment report. And what you're looking at is not so much what would happen to nature, but rather what models say would happen to nature. There's now 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen of vegetation models sort of global vegetation models that will tell you how do, in this case, biomes change if climate changes. And what you're looking at is agreement, and the darker the color, the more agreement you see between these models. And the prediction here is, will a biome shift occur? Now, that doesn't mean anything to you. A biome is the savanna, or the rainforest, or the boreal forest, right? That is what you should understand to be a biome. And a biome shift means that the rainforest will be replaced by savanna, right? Or the tundra will be replaced by boreal forest. That is what these colors mean. So this is not, we will see slightly different trees or slightly different plants. This is, the landscape will be completely and utterly different from what it is now. Right? That is what this means. And what you see is that this is actually widespread over the world, right? So these are large and dramatic changes. I hasten to add that these vegetation models are vegetation models, right? They don't have animals in. There's implications for animal life as well that just follows from first principles, but we're actually pretty bad at modeling animals still. So basically, major changes in the way nature functions, the way nature looks across the world. We can put a little bit more specifics on that. Typically what you would find is that plant species and animal species that basically do well everywhere and anywhere, the sort of stuff that you see in many, many places, the so-called generalists, they will be fine with climate change. The species that are sort of on the margin of their existence, that on the ends of their ecological niche, they will either go extinct or they will thrive, right, if their ecological niche actually expands. Those are, of course, the things that you don't see everywhere. Those are, of course, the species that we care about most, because they are special. They are what makes nature special, right? And that is what we as humans care about most. An example of this is edelweiss, right? Edelweiss is actually a pretty remarkable plant. It's the only plant that can grow high up in the Alps. And that is tough because it's high up in the mountains, so you have these huge temperature swings. In winter you're covered by a meter or more of snow, right? Most plants just won't survive that. And then because it's so high up, you also have high levels of UV radiation. Now, edelweiss actually can grow anywhere. It can also grow down in the valley, but it cannot compete with other plants down in the valley. So what would happen if it gets warmer? Then edelweiss would want to move north, right? If it's in the southern Alps, that would be a problem because it would need to travel through the valley. It cannot jump from one mountain to the next, so that is an issue. And of course in the northern Alps there is a bigger issue, and that is that the next mountain range is in Scandinavia, right? So you can expect that plants like edelweiss would go locally extinct, right? It may survive in people's gardens, right, where you can sort of like keep down the competition, but in the wild it's a different story. This is another example. The Vietnamese golden cypress grows in a very narrow range on the mountain. Too far south, it's too far down the mountain, it can't compete. Too far up the mountain, there's no soil. If it gets warmer, its niche will simply be squeezed out of existence, and therefore this, what some people think is a magnificent tree, would go extinct, right? So, let's turn to agriculture. Now, what is true for unmanaged ecosystems, that if climate changes, then everything will change with it, is also true for managed ecosystems. Managed ecosystems is better known as agriculture, right? And here we're looking at another graph from not the sixth but the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. Pretty short. What we're looking at is the three most important crops. That's maize, that's wheat, and that's rice. And together these provide about 70% of all the calories that we eat. So this is what feeds the world, right? Now this is for the temperate places in the world, and this is for the tropical places. So this is where we are. And then the red dots are individual studies, and these are crop models. So these are sort of models that will tell you how well does your rice plant or your maize plant or your wheat plant do in this particular location and on the range of scenarios, right? That is what the red dots are. The vertical axis is the change in yield. Here given in change, the yield would be the tons per hectare that you get out, right? And then on the horizontal axis, we have the temperature change, not because the temperature change is all that matters, but as an index of the severity of climate change, right? Now, what do you see in red? You see a slight decline in maize, slight decline in wheat, slight decline in rice, all in the tropics. A steeper decline in the temperate region. In the tropical regions, you see a much steeper decline in wheat, because wheat is essentially a cold-loving plant, and you would wonder why you're growing it in the tropics in the first place. So a steep decline. Rice is doing better than that. Maize, which is also a heat-loving plant, does sees negative impacts as well, right? In the order of 5%. Here we actually go up to minus 50, right? So a halving of the harvest. So those are the red results. And some of them are relatively minor, right? 5% decline in rice yields over what is 1.5 centuries. That's perhaps not something to worry about, but a halving of the crop, that would be something that would get you concerned, right? Even over such a long period. Now the red curves assume that people don't respond. And this is the so-called dumb farmer hypothesis. That is, I think, best illustrated not with agriculture, but with sea level rise. So what you're looking at here is a picture of a beach, and people are sunbathing, right? One of the implications of climate change is that sea levels will rise, perhaps by 0.5 meter, perhaps by 1 meter. And if we take this woman here, she lies with her head 30 centimeters above the level of the sea. So if sea level rises by 50 centimeters, then she will drown, right? Will she? Not really, right? Because 50 meters of sea level rise will sort of happen by the end of the century. The typical time that people spend on the beach is 2 to 3 hours. So she won't be there in 100 years' time. If she comes back in 100 years' time, or rather if her grandchildren come back in 100 years' time, they will sort of notice that the sea has moved in, and they will not insist to lie on the exact same spot that grandma used to lie, right? Because that would indeed drown them, right? Now, this particular insight is not a thorough insight, you would think. But at one point, Harold Groenspecht actually had to put up this particular graph and say, look, you guys, this is what you're assuming. And in the red dots and in the red lines, that is what people assume. That farmers will continue to plant the same varieties at the same time as they always have, harvest at the same time as they always have, apply the same amount of fertilizer, the same amount of pesticide as they always have, and will just continue to do what they have done. And this is a time span of 100 years, what their father did and what their grandfather did. And that is the assumption that is made here. Even if they observe that the crops keep failing and failing and failing and failing, they keep on doing the exact same thing as their ancestors did. Now, people call this the dumb farmer hypothesis or the dumb farmer assumption, but really it's the analyst who is dumb here, right? Farmers, I can tell you, are not at all stupid, right? In blue, you're looking at the results if we assume that farmers respond to what is going on their farm, that they observe things and that they respond to that. And then you see actually a different picture, right? If we focus on wheat in the temperate regions, then with on-farm adaptation, the negatives of climate change turn into positives. Basically no impact on maize, a much less dramatic impact on wheat, and also in the tropical regions, rice turns from negative to positive, right? And this is on-farm adaptation only. You also see that this is not true here. The numbers here is the number of observations that are used. So what is going on here is selection bias, right? And the geniuses that wrote this particular report did not know how to correct for selection bias. So that is an important thing to keep in mind here, right? That climate change is not something that happens and we just live with the consequences. We're actually gonna do our best to minimize the negative impacts of climate change and to make the most of the positive impacts of climate change, right? Now, what can you say here? Different crops, different places, different responses, right? What does this mean for the world food supply? That is shown in this particular graph. Again, we have warming as an indicator of climate change. What we're looking at here not is production, total production, but we're looking at output prices. So this is the aggregate food price on the world market. And you see different results here. In these two lines, food prices are going up, which must mean that yields have gone down, right? So this is overall negative right from the start. And then we have these two lines that actually show an initial drop in prices. That is, yields have gone up, and then things turn negative, right? Of course, there's an immediate distributional issue here as well, right? Increasing prices is bad for us as consumers, but it's not necessarily bad for the farmer, right? So there's distributional stuff going on. Now, why do these two studies find initially positive impacts of climate change and these two studies find only negative impacts of climate change? The difference is CO2 fertilization. So how does photosynthesis work, right? You may recall when photosynthesizing a plant uses sunlight and combines the sunlight with CO2 that's taken from the air and water that is taken from the soil mostly. And with that it builds carbohydrates, right? It splits the oxygen from this carbon, right, and the CO2, and it splits the hydrogen from the oxygen, then it dumps the oxygen back into the atmosphere as a waste product, good for us and not for them. And then there's a C and a H, and it uses then the sunlight the energy in the sunlight to combine it into a carbohydrate that is used to make stems and leaves and flowers and roots and what have you, right? Now, the root cause of climate change is that there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. And CO2 is plant food, right? So plants grow faster if there's more CO2. That is actually a fairly small effect because CO2 is rarely the limiting factor in plant growth. It's typically other nutrients that limit plant growth. However, plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere through their stomata. Stomata can be seen as mouths. Essentially, plants open their mouths that are on the leaf to grab CO2 from the atmosphere. And you may have had a bad cold recently. Many people have. And what you have is your nose is blocked. You sleep with your mouth open. You wake up with a very dry mouth. You're very, very thirsty because you're evaporating water through your mouth. The same is true for plants. If they open their stomata, they evaporate water. Now, if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, they can keep their stomata closed for longer. That means they don't evaporate so much water. And that means that plants become more drought tolerant if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. Right? And that is actually a big effect. And that explains the difference between these studies and these studies. Right? So CO2 fertilization is actually a good thing, particularly if you're sort of in dry areas or semi-arid areas and you're doing agriculture there. Plants love CO2 in those circumstances. Of course, we also stick CO2 into glass houses, right? Because in greenhouses or in glass houses, nutrients are not a limiting factor in plant growth, and CO2 and water are, right? So we pump CO2 into greenhouses, and that makes those very big bell peppers that you see in the shop, right? So, adaptation is hugely important. CO2 fertilization is hugely important as well. This is on-farm adaptation. These results are from international trade models, so-called computable general equilibrium models, that also has off-farm adaptation. It also has that, well, if plants grow better in one place than another, and those comparative advantages would change, then you would also see changes in trade patterns and changes in specialization patterns, right? But these are the sort of like your standard economic models where agents are assumed to be rational, have perfect foresight, and also assume that governments don't get in the way of the market, right? So sort of like these assumptions that make the analysis very convenient because the maths is simple, but not particularly realistic. There's all sorts of interventions in particularly agriculture that may make adaptation to climate change harder. And the example that you're looking at here is a bit outdated, right? UK is still in the European Union in this example, but it highlights the problem. So agriculture is the most subsidized economic sector, not just in Europe, but across the world. And the subsidies around the world have one particular purpose, two particular purposes, and then in Europe there is a third one, and that is what is shown on the graph. Worldwide, farmers are shielded from international competition, which means that if it no longer makes sense to grow wheat in Italy because it's getting too hot, that it would make sense to shift wheat production from Italy to, say, Germany. That would be the natural trade response. But if farmers are shielded from international competition, and actually the shift from Italy to Germany is a very bad example here, right? Because both in the EU, then of course that adaptation would not take place. So that is one form where trade protection gets in the way of adaptation. Another thing that we see around the world is that farmers are protected from market volatility. essentially, if prices are good, then farmers don't get much subsidy. If prices are bad, then the government steps in and gives them income or price support, right? Now, you may argue that that is a good thing, but the implication is, of course, that a series of bad harvests, because those losses are socialized, do not hurt the farmers as much as it should, and therefore weakens the incentive to the farmers to change their behavior, right? And these sort of farm supports are everywhere, essentially, or everywhere where the government can afford this. Now, the map that you're looking at is specific to Europe, and the Common Agricultural Policy has the explicit purpose of reducing regional disparities between regional disparities in farmer incomes. Right? So if you're a farmer in a place where you really should not be farming, and you really make little money from your farming, then the EU will step in and give you income support. And we've seen that, for instance, in the mountains of Portugal, right? The place to farm in Portugal is along the coast, right, where there's soil, rather than in the mountains where there's just rocks, and this is really a stupid place to do farming, right? But you see that they get lots and lots of support. The darker the color, the greater the farm support. Similarly, this is a sort of place where really you don't want to farm here, get away, right? Or if you're only familiar with Britain, you sort of like see this is also a place where the hills are steep, the soils are poor, the climate is terrible, and really you would not want to grow anything here. But if you do, you won't make much money on the market, but the EU will step in, past tense, to support you. And the implication is, of course, that you have no reason to stop farming there, right? So, it's not just positive adaptation, there's also maladaptation, as it's called in the literature, and in this case, government intervention essentially locks farmers into current practices. And of course, if circumstances change, you should not be doing things as you've always done. You should actually start doing things differently. This actually is taking a turn for the worse, because both the EU and the UK are now actively rewarding people to do sort of heritage farming, to do things like things were done in the 1950s or the 1900s, right? Which is nice and cute, but really the climate has completely changed, and you should not be doing things like they were done in the year 1900, right? Okay, let's look at water and how to adapt. So in the first week I talked about how climate change also affects rainfall patterns. So that is one aspect. It also affects the demand for water, right? If the hotter you drink more, if it's warmer and drier, you need to irrigate your crops more. That's actually a much more important application of water resources. And if your machinery gets hotter, particularly your power plants get hotter, or your nuclear plants get hotter, then you need more cooling water to make sure that they don't melt, right? So all those things, demand is changing, supply is changing, right? And quite dramatically, there's another awful graph from the IPCC. Awful because of the color coding, right? So for those who are colorblind, you can't tell red from blue. Can't see anything here, right? But also because actually on this map red is good and blue is bad. So what we're looking at is flood frequency. And we're looking at a 100-year flood. So this is not the flood that occurs every 100th year, but this is the flood that has a 1% chance of occurring in any year, right? So that is what a return period means. If we go to the red, then the flood frequency increases from 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000. So the flood becomes less frequent, which we typically see as good. So that is what the red means, right? And in blue, the flood frequency goes from 1 in 100 years to every other year. So that is bad, right? And what you take away from this map is that except in those places where there's no water to start with and therefore no floods, flood frequencies will change, right? And will change quite dramatically, right? Again, will we sit on our hands and just let this happen to us, right? That leads me to the question, how to adapt. In most cases, adaptation is actually pretty simple. If you're talking about a farmer of annual crops, then you're planting now. I mean, if you're growing winter wheat, then you're sowing now, or maybe next week because you're plowing this week. Oh, weather is a bit bad. But what matters for your crop is the temperature and the rainfall over the next 6 months. If it's winter wheat, if you're doing summer wheat, the growing season is 3 months. So what matters is what's going to happen with the weather over the next 3 months. And then next year, you make another decision what to plant and when to plant, right? So the fact that climate change, or that the climate will be different in 50 years' time, is completely irrelevant for your decision, right? Similarly, if you go sunbathing on the beach, what matters is the beach over the next few hours, not the beach as it may be in 100 years' time, right? That's completely irrelevant for your decisions. So the uncertainties about future climate change only matter really if you're doing a long-lived investment, right? If you're making a capital investment. It's say irrigation or something like that where you're supposed to last for decades, if not centuries, right? And of course, in parts of the Mediterranean, we are still using the irrigation systems that were built by the Muslims before the Reconquista, right? So they lasted more than 1,000 years. And then the other problem is, of course, that sometimes you just don't know what's going to happen. So these are the projections for temperature. And the projections for temperature are relatively simple, right? It may warm a little or it may warm a lot. And you need to be able to cope with that. These are projections for rainfall. I did not show this graph, I showed a different one. This is the northern winter, this is the northern summer. Brown is dry, blue is wet. This is from an older IPCC report when they used to know what colors mean. The dotted areas is where models agree on the sign. And where there's no dots, models do not agree on the sign. So if we look over at the Horn of Africa, for instance, in summer, the average is actually no change, but that is because some models say it will get wetter and other models say it will get drier. And if you're trying to build an irrigation system there, then you wonder, like, should I make it bigger or should I make it smaller than I would have had there not been any climate change, right? And actually what you see is that those areas that are not dotted are fairly large. Also, if we focus on India, and it's only 1.2, 1.3 billion people living there, right? We don't know. We don't know what the monsoon will do with climate change, and different models, I mean, all models say that the monsoon will be different in the future, but models do not agree on how the monsoon will be different. So, long-lived infrastructure that you need for water, you have the complication that you just don't know what the future will bring. The only thing that you know for certain is that the future will not be like the past, right? So their irrigation or adaptation becomes difficult, right? And there's essentially two strategies that you can do there, that you can use there. One, you can make the system just more robust so that it can cope with anything that the future might throw at you. Or you can make the system more flexible. That you don't make the you simply minimize the duration of your decision. Instead of setting things in stone, you sort of say, I'm going to make sure that in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, if new information has arisen, I can adjust my plan, right? That is really the strategy that you should take. Now, this is the sort of stuff that people in operations research and engineers absolutely love, because it's really, really complicated, right? The maths get really complicated, the engineering gets really exciting. So these are problems that are solvable and that some people actually salivate over, right? Because these are really intellectually hard problems. They can be dealt with, but this is what you should keep in mind, right? That some of these problems just require really, really clever solutions, right? And one thing that is local is, and I said that in the first week, if you look at where we are, it will get drier in summer and wetter in winter, right? So you have worse droughts in summer, worse floods in winter. So how do you solve that? Well, the solution to the winter problem is simple. You drain your rivers and then the water will flow faster to the sea, right? And then you think, I've solved the problem, right? But of course, if the water flows faster to the sea in winter, it will also flow faster to the sea in summer, right? So you've actually worsened your drought problem. So that is not a solution. You can raise dikes everywhere to protect your property. That's very expensive. Probably what you want to do in a place like this, and something that the government actually in places is doing right, because it's not the government who's in charge, but the Environment Agency, which is sort of like a backwater of the government, so the ministers don't interfere, right? The politicians stay away from this, is that you increase retention areas. That rather than letting the water flow as fast as you can to the sea, you store it in winter and then you have the water still in summer to use, right? That is probably the solution that you want to take for a situation like this. And if droughts in summer get worse and floods in winter get worse, then you simply need more and bigger retention areas, right? That is the way to deal with problems like this. And as I said, engineers love to work out exactly how to do that, right? But in most cases, systems change much faster than climate change, and decisions have only short-lived consequences, and therefore you don't need to worry so much about these things. I'm making good progress. We're going to talk about heat stress, and then we're going to have a break. I'm going to talk about heat stress as a medical problem, and then we're going to talk about public and private adaptation. So there's a whole bunch of impacts of climate change that I have skipped, right? Climate change affects energy production, definitely now that we rely more on wind and solar. It also affects the use of energy. If it gets hotter in winter, you need to heat your home less. Substantial cost saving. You also would need more cooling energy in summertime, right? So those are important also. If it gets warmer, resistance in electricity transmission lines goes up, so you actually lose more of your electricity, and so on and so on. The whole range of impacts. Tourism is obviously affected, right? We go to the Mediterranean in summer because the weather is guaranteed nice, right? The weather can be nice in England, but there's no guarantees, right? The tourism patterns will be affected. What we've seen in the last summer, and actually over the last while, is that places like Greece in July and August simply get too hot for us northerners, right? Simply, it's unbearable, and the wildfires, of course, do not help. It's raining out. As you may have noticed, if it rains very heavily, then all construction stops because you simply can't do anything. So climate change will affect construction, will affect transport, right? If bridges are washed away by floods, you can't really cross the river anymore. It will affect labor productivity. We'll get to that, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that worries people quite a bit is how climate affects human health directly. And that is what I'm going to talk about. After the break, I'm also going to talk about infectious disease and vector-borne disease. So, we are warm-blooded animals, right? We need to keep our core temperature at 37 or close to 37 degrees Celsius. If not, our organs will fail, right? So, what happens if it's very hot out? Our cooling mechanism is partly behavioral, we do less, and partly physiological, that is, we start sweating, right? That is our way to keep cool, and that's actually a uniquely human trait. Now, that takes energy. And you may recall during the 2 hot heat waves that we had this year, 2 short heat waves, I should say, that we had this year, is that you're feeling very tired. And that is because your body is working very hard to keep cool, right? So that is actually something that affects labor productivity. And indications are that the effect of heat stress on labor productivity is actually fairly large and has large economic consequences as well. And some projections are that labor productivity will fall by 10, maybe 20, maybe 30% by the end of the century because of warming. And if you recall your micro, then wages are roughly proportional to labor productivity, right? So if you take away 20% of labor productivity, to a first approximation, you take away 20% of your income, right? So these are big effects. And they're particularly pronounced in Southeast Asia, where it's very humid. So as I said, we cool our body by sweating. That is, we evaporate water. But if you have 100% humidity, you can't evaporate water because the air is not capable of absorbing more water, right? And that is why humid heat is so much worse for us than dry heat. So the human body gets into trouble in dry heat around 55 degrees Celsius. That is with 0% humidity. The human body gets into trouble at 35 degrees at 100% humidity, right? Now that is what happens to young and healthy people. They get tired and therefore cannot work as hard. If you are very old, then you simply cannot handle that tiredness. If you are very young, under 6 months, babies don't sweat, right? So the mother and father needs to keep the baby cool because she can't herself, right? So young babies are in trouble if it gets very hot. And because it puts such stress on your body, people with heart problems or respiratory problems, problems of the lung, get into trouble as well, right? And they may die. And I'll give you some numbers in a moment. So that is a major concern. On the other hand, winters will get less cold, right? And there's also issues with cold stress. They're actually fairly limited. If you have severe heart problems, then cold is bad for you. If you're stupid enough to drink too much when it's very cold, and you go out without a coat and you run into the water, then that may kill you, right? But this sort of happens to a few people per year only, so this is a relatively small problem. A much bigger issue is that when it's cold, we spend more time indoors, and therefore we are closer to other people. And that means that infectious disease like the flu run rampant in winter, but not in summer, because in summer we keep our distance from others, right? And in places like the UK, winter deaths are actually much larger than summer deaths. And because of climate change, this may actually lead to a reduction in overall mortality. But let's return to heat stress. What should you do when it gets hot, right? Well, you should wear little clothes, right? You should stay calm. You should keep out of the sun, even when you're English, right? Stay out of the sun when it's hot. And you should drink lots. But no alcohol, because alcohol opens your pores, right? You actually get into trouble. You drink water, don't drink alcohol when it's very hot. It's bad for you. And these are private decisions, right? I don't need to tell you that you should not put on your winter coat when it's 30 degrees out, right? That is something that your mother or your father or whoever taught you when you were very young. It's actually around year 5 or so that kids begin to realize the connection between the clothes that they're wearing and how hot that they feel. But after that, you should be able to figure this out for yourself, right? You can say, well, it's not entirely private, we are not used to the heat, so perhaps there should be some sort of public information campaign where Rishi Sunak will tell you that you should take off your coat when it's hot, but those things are not particularly effective. And you say, nonsense, right? So this is a strictly private decision. Some adaptation to the heat is not private, but more social or collective. So if you've been to Barcelona on a holiday, then you would have noticed that people there have their dinner very late in the evening. And you may have thought this is very peculiar, but there's actually a good reason for that. Digesting food takes energy and heats up your body. So if you live in a hot place, you want to have your main meal during the cool of the night, right? If you live in a cold place like England, you want to have your main meal in the middle of the day, or perhaps at the end of the afternoon. But not at midnight, right? That's just silliness, right? But this is not an individual choice. If you live in northern Germany, as I've done for a while, and you go to a restaurant at 8 o'clock in the evening, they look at you like, we're closed. Decent people are in bed by this time, right? Whereas if you show up in a restaurant at 8 in the evening in Barcelona, they say, you're early, right? The kitchen isn't open yet, right? So there is a collective element to this. Similarly, siestas make perfect sense in hot places. That you sleep through the heat of the day, say between 12 and 4. And that is a decision that you can make. But there's lectures on, right? So this is not a decision that you as an individual can make. This is something that society sort of makes collectively. That we start work at 6, we work till 12, we close everything until 4, and then we work again from 4 to 8, as you see in many hot countries, right? And really, as I said, the best that the government can do here, should do, is awareness and preparedness campaigns, but they should not really get involved. But that does not mean that there's no role for government here at all, right? So in the 2003 heat wave in France, which is 20 years ago, estimates differ. The best estimate is that 43,000 people died during that summer, during August. Excess deaths. Other people put it up to 60,000 or even more. Now, 43,000 is more than the 1,400 that were killed by Hamas in Israel a few weeks ago, right? It's also more than the Israelis are killing in Gaza, or have killed in Gaza over the last few weeks. 43,000 people is a lot of people, right? In 9/11, 9,000 people died when the Twin Towers came down. 43,000 is a major number for a country like France. Why, right? Well, it was very, very hot. But what happened in August of 2003, really? So it was really hot. People got into trouble. Older people, people with respiratory problems, people with cardiovascular problems got into trouble. They went to, reported themselves at the hospital, and it was August in France. All the nurses and doctors were on holiday. So the medical system was simply not there to support them. There's no planning for this. The only person who could override the system and call back nurses and doctors from holiday to take care of all the people who were suffering from heat stress was the Minister of Health, who was on holiday himself and who did not read newspapers about what was going on in his country and did not come back from holiday either. So the medical system was simply not there to support them, right? And that is why 43,000 people died, because of this guy who should have been locked up for genocide, right? But wasn't. Now we learned from this. France now has a very robust system for heat waves, and what we've seen in heat waves that were actually more severe than the 2003 one, that much fewer people died, right? It's still problematic, but not nearly as bad as 2003. And those plans, it's not just that people in France sort of set up and say, oh my God, what just happened? We've actually seen these sort of heat wave plans propagate through Europe, and they're working. If you look at, not last summer, but summers before that in the UK, we had pretty severe heat waves, but the health consequences are actually fairly limited. So that was France. Other things are from the United States. Chicago, right? So, gets very hot, what do? You want to go to an air-conditioned place. If you're too poor to have air conditioning yourself, the logical place to go is to the shopping mall, right? Which is air-conditioned. But in Chicago, security personnel had strict instructions to throw anybody out who was not obviously shopping, right? Also during heat waves. So there you sort of like see an immediate sort of public response as well. During heat waves, you should create cold banks. And the people who run the cold banks should not throw out the oldies who are just sitting there keeping cool, right? And you cannot expect security guards who are typically not very well educated and definitely under strict rules about how to behave and what to do. You cannot expect them to sort this out. You need instructions from higher up. Philly, another heat wave, post-mortem of the heat, lots of people died, hundreds of people died. What happened? Well, two things happened. So they went into the places where people had died from heat stroke and found out that they had a fan. They could have turned on the fan to keep them cool, but they could not afford the electricity to run the fan. So there the public response is to give income support or perhaps targeted price support for electricity during heat waves, right? They also found at the ground floor that people did not open their windows. Essentially cooked to death in their apartment. And the reason for that was that people were so afraid of crime, so afraid of burglars or worse coming into their house, that they kept their windows shut. So the public response there is to send more policemen and policewomen onto the street to create this feeling of safety, right? Again, this is a public response. And of course, it only works in places where people sort of like see the police as protectors, right? Rather than as predators. You do want to have more bobbies on the beat anyway during hot times, because it's not just that people get tired when it's hot. People also get more irritable when it's hot. And there is a suggestion that during hot times we become more impulsive, we lose self-control. So when your neighbor is annoying during normal temperatures, you think the neighbor is annoying. But when the neighbor is annoying during a heat wave, you go and bang him over the head, right? That is one thing that happened. We see sort of like spontaneous violent crime go up during hot periods, and that means that you need more security there. This is also true for sexual crimes, that sexual assault goes up during heat waves. And this is, experimental evidence suggests, or natural experimental evidence suggests, is because men lose self-control, right? Nothing to do with the way the women behave, nothing the way the victims dress, has everything to do with men losing self-control. So you've been warned, right? During hot waves you may lose self-control, don't be that dick, right? In all these cases, right, adaptation is a mix of private and public action, right? And that's to keep in mind, a good thing to keep in mind. Some of these things are up to yourself, like turn on your air conditioning, don't turn up your thermostat. The other things, yeah, we need the public, the government to act as well. So, in the first week, talked about sea level rise. If water warms, it expands, gets warmer, ice melts, all that leads to sea level rise. The implication of that is land goes up, water goes up, land disappears under the sea, right? Erosion goes up, you have permanent inundation in some places. That is not something that we would let happen to us. Definitely in densely populated areas, the more important implication of sea level rise is that we would spend more on dikes and seawalls and groins and what have you. So that is one implication. Two implications of sea level rise. There's a lot of coastal wetlands, so that the transition from dry to wet is actually very gradual in most places. The natural response of coastal wetlands, if the sea rises, is to migrate inland. That is what you would see most likely happen in a natural system. Unless sea level is really, really fast, then the wetland drowns. The problem with coastal protection is essentially you put up seawalls or dikes to protect the dryland, and that means that the wetland has no place to migrate to. So the coastal protection that is there to protect cities and protect a little bit of agricultural land in some cases would also prevent wetland migration, and that then leads to the loss of wetlands. Now, wetlands are particularly important as nurseries for fish, so this has knock-on effects for fisheries and biodiversity. Also, wetlands are an important place, particularly for migrant birds, who sort of like use this as a place to stop and refuel on their journey. So wetland loss can be particularly severe, can have particularly severe effects on biodiversity. Another problem with sea level rise that people don't often think about is saltwater intrusion. So sort of the picture that people have in mind of sea level rise is that these atoll islands in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, in places like the Maldives or Tuvalu, that will drown because of sea level rise. And that is true. The highest point in Tuvalu is 1.5 meters above sea level. So, and we can expect 2-3 meters of sea level rise by the end of the next century. So Tuvalu will drown. The whole country will simply go underwater. And you may think that is a big problem, and that is true, but it's actually not the biggest problem in a place like Tuvalu. So the sea is salty and therefore unsuitable for drinking and unsuitable for plants, for terrestrial plants that is. Whereas the groundwater that we rely on for growing crops as well as for drinking water is fresh water. And somewhere near the coast there is the boundary between the two. Now, if the sea level rises, that means that the pressure on the freshwater system, the groundwater system, will increase, and that means that the boundary between fresh and salt water will travel inwards, land inwards. And that can actually be, depending on the system, that can actually be quite substantial. In some cases, for every meter of sea level rise, the saltwater boundary moves by 100 meters or so inland. Not a big issue on a big island like Great Britain, right? But on small atoll islands, this is actually a big issue. They rely for the drinking water and for their irrigation water and for the crops on a groundwater bell that sits underneath the island. And if sea level rises, then salt water will intrude there, and that actually happens much, much more quicker than the islands will drown. That some people reckon that a place like Tuvalu will be uninhabitable by 2050. It will still be above water, but it will not have any groundwater, not any fresh water left, right? So this is actually the much more urgent problem for a lot of places. So what is the order of magnitude of the impacts of sea level rise? Again, adaptation is terribly important. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at sea level rise. So this is sort of by the end of the century, this is by the end of the next century. On the vertical axis, we're looking at the number of people who are flooded per year. And this is a logarithmic scale. And what you see is that this is the current situation. With sea level rise, without sea level rise, the number of people flooded is around, I believe this is 40 million people per year. that would go up to 400,000 maybe, oh, yeah, 400,000, maybe 500,000 people per year. So that's a tenfold increase, right? And that is bad enough. Now there are more lines here. Forget about the different colors. In the dashed line, the assumption is that coastal protection will evolve over time. And essentially the assumption here is that the protection levels that are currently there will be maintained into the future. And that makes some difference, but not a big difference. This line here, the dashed line, the finely dashed line, I don't know what to call it, has an alternative assumption. If you look across the world, then what you would see is that a place like the Netherlands has very heavy protection against floods, and the protection level in a place like Amsterdam or Rotterdam is 1 in 10,000. That is the storm that occurs every 10,000 years or has a probability of 1/100% every year would not damage Amsterdam, right? That is what a protection level of 1 in 10,000 means. Whereas if you look at pictures of Lagos, for instance, which is another city, another major city that is close to the coast, you see some places there's no coastal protection at all. In other places you see a seawall that is about this high. And they may be protected against the 1 in 10-year storm, but not much more than that. And the reason for this is, of course, that one country is poor, the other is rich, and therefore the rich country can protect itself. Now, if we roughly apply that relationship to coastal protection, and we sort of say, well, sea level rises, that's because climate has changed, that is because we emitted more CO2 into the atmosphere, that is because there's more economic activity, right? So people are richer because that is where the CO2 comes from. We then apply that relationship to coastal protection, we end up in this line. And what you see is that the difference here and here is a factor 10. Recall this is a logarithmic scale, which is the same as the effect of sea level rise itself, right? So again, adaptation has this similar effect, similar size effect as climate change itself, right? And that is the important message of this graph. Another message of this graph is that we couldn't keep our baseline straight, right? It should all start at the same point. Now, what is important in all this is what is known in the literature as adaptive capacity, which is just another way of saying the ability to adapt. And adaptive capacity depends on 3 basic things. And I'm going to illustrate this with sea level rise. So one thing you can do if the sea rises is you can build a dike, right? That to keep the water out. And if you're not aware of this technology, then you are in trouble. Now, this is a silly assumption. Any kid who's been on the beach, on a sandy beach, has tried to build a dike, right, to keep the seawater out. Basically all fails, but the basic idea of building an earthen structure to turn the water away has occurred to us when we were 3 or 4, right? And actually we don't know who first built proper dikes. We do know that the Sumerians built them 5,000 years ago, right? So this is a pretty basic technology, and basically everybody knows about this. Of course, technology has progressed substantially since Sumerian times, right? So the availability of technology is one crucial part of adaptive capacity. Second thing is that you need to be able to pay for this, right? Those things don't come cheap, right? So technology is important, but also the ability to pay for the technology. And then the third thing that is important is that you need to be able to organize this as a government, if it's a public good, like coastal protection is. And this, I think, rather than talk about this in an abstract sense, I'm going to show you an example, right? Or I'm going to show you two examples. And one example is a delta, very densely populated, vulnerable to floods from the sea as well as floods from the river, and the occasional big storm that comes through, right? The other example is a delta that is densely populated with floods from the river and the sea and the occasional big storm, right? And one example is called Bangladesh and the other example is called the Netherlands. And nobody thinks that the Netherlands is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise, and everybody thinks that Bangladesh is very, very vulnerable to sea level rise. The question is, how come, right? What is the difference between the Netherlands and Bangladesh? Well, if we look at the ability to pay, in blue you're looking at per capita income for the Netherlands. Was stagnant throughout the 18th century, then Napoleon came along, wrecked the economy, and then the economy started growing, right? In orange, you're looking at per capita income in Bangladesh 250 years later, right? And what you see is that Bangladesh now is actually richer, about as rich as the Netherlands was in 1800, and about as rich as the Netherlands was in 1850. And 1850 is important because 1850 is the year that the Dutch started building dikes properly. So there's no difference in income really. Bangladesh and the Netherlands are about as rich at the time when the Dutch started building dikes. Let's look at technology. This is not 1850, right, because there were no cameras. This is 1930, when the Zuiderzee was enclosed, right, the big enclosure dike. And what you see is, yeah, there is some steam engines, right, and there is a dragline, a steam dragline, believe it or not. But this dike was essentially built by men with shovels and wheelbarrows, right? That is what you see. This is how the early dikes were built in the Netherlands. And these fairly primitive structures to lift weights, right? Now, if you look at dike building in Bangladesh, you still see a lot of people because labor is cheap. But you also see modern drag lines, right? You see modern materials. So technologically, Bangladesh is much, much further ahead than the Netherlands was in 1850, right? Much further ahead. And I'm not talking even about progress in engineering knowledge. I'm not talking about satellites that can actually monitor the coast. I'm not talking about sediment flow models or anything like that. Computers, right? Bangladesh is much, much more advanced technologically than the Netherlands was in 1850. Right? No dispute there. So what is the difference between Bangladesh and the Netherlands, really? Well, what is the problem in Bangladesh? Corruption is terrible. So what you need for building a dike is a government that collects taxes and then spends that money on a public good. And the important thing here is that money, first you need to be able to collect the money, which is difficult enough in poorer societies, but you also need to make sure that the money doesn't get siphoned off and disappears into a bank account in Switzerland, or in the Bangladeshi case, into a villa in London, right? That is where a lot of tax money in Bangladesh ends up. So that is a problem, right? The government is simply, money disappears, right? Another problem that used to be a big problem in Bangladesh, but now is no longer, is that you had this rapidly switching of political parties, and the main aim of politicians in Bangladesh used to be to get rich, and because you could expect to be in power only for a few years, to get rich quick, right? So steal a lot of money very quickly. And the second priority of politicians in Bangladesh was to get even with the political opposition, throw them in jail, have them killed, whatever. And then perhaps as a third priority is to actually govern the country, right? And in that sort of system, then, yeah, the political will, the political ability may simply not be there to actually solve the problems of the country. Another issue is like who is actually represented in government. And the Bangladesh is nominally a democracy. If this is the map of poverty, so the circled areas is where poverty is concentrated. And these areas is where the floods are concentrated. And it's simply the case that the severe floods affect the poor. It's nominally a democracy, but the poor can be bought off with a sack of rice or a t-shirt or a handout of some rupees, and they will vote for you, right? So they can be very easily bought off. Rich people in Bangladesh live in Dhaka, which is further up the hills, or in London, right? So they don't care, it doesn't affect them. And then there's another problem, that is if you interview people, the poor people in the flood-prone areas, and you ask them what caused this flood, then a good few of them will say this is a punishment from Allah for our sins, or for my neighbor's sins, right? And if you don't make that connection between what happens to you and what the government did do wrong or didn't do, there is no reason to vote out the government, right? Because it's not the government's fault. Now, I'm not bashing Muslims here, right? This has nothing to do with Islam. As I said, dike building started in the Netherlands in the 1850s. There were a series of interviews in the 1870s, and people in the countryside said you should not build dikes because dikes get in the way of the flood, and the floods are sent by God, so trying to stop that flood is blasphemy, right? And these were not Muslims, these were Christians, right? So it has nothing to do with any particular religion and everything to do with a lack of basic understanding of how the world works. So in this situation, like, no wonder that Bangladesh is so very vulnerable. Now, what happened in the Netherlands, right? A very brief history. In 1848, we had the European Spring, right? The people of Europe rose up against their overlords. At that time, the Netherlands was governed by what we now would call oligarchs, but we then called merchants, right? So it was ruled by the rich elite for the rich elite, right? And people rose up, very different responses in different parts of Europe. In the Netherlands was constitutional reform, 1849, associated with the name of Thorbecke. It had two things. One, it established a central government. The reason that the Netherlands is called the Netherlands plural is because it used to be a confederation, right? And this is the time when the Netherlands became one country. And the second thing is that this government was broadly representative of the people. Now, don't overdo it, right? So women did not have the vote and Catholics did not have the vote, right? So it was broadly representative of the male Protestant part of the population, but many of them were subject and vulnerable to flooding. So the first thing the new government did was go after public enemy number one, and that is floods, right? And started building dikes, right? So you have a government that does the will of the people and that is competent. And as soon as that is there, the public goods starting to be provided, right? Okay, 2 more chapters and 17 more minutes. Let's talk about infectious disease and technological change and mules. I can talk about the foundation again, right? Although you guys may not have iPhones and iTV, right? Apple TV it's called. So, what I've said by now is that vulnerability to climate change is a function of exposure as well as adaptive capacity, the ability to respond, right? And they depend on development. And the implication is that future vulnerability will be very different from today's vulnerability, right? This is a complicated relationship, and rather, again, than talk about this in an abstract sense, I'm going to talk about malaria, right? So, what you're looking at here is how climate change will affect the incidence of malaria. And the way, the world map, the way to read the colors is light is yellow is a small increase in malaria, red means a doubling of malaria. Right, and what you see is increases basically everywhere. There is also green on the map, and green is where the malaria risk falls, and there is really green on the map, but there is not a lot. And then there's also purple on the map, and that is where malaria is newly introduced, and there's also some purple on the map. But what you see is a fairly substantial and very widespread increase in malaria. The reason for this is threefold. One, the parasite grows faster when it's warmer. So the incubation period becomes shorter. That's one reason. Second reason is that mosquitoes that carry the parasite are more active when it's warmer. So more mosquito bites when it's hotter. And the third reason is that mosquitoes need warm, still standing water to breed. So in a warmer, wetter world, you would expect more malaria. And that is what this model says will happen. This is a world map, again, of 5 colors. And the key difference is between the red and the yellow. In red, we're looking at those places where there is malaria. In yellow, we're looking at those places where there could be malaria, but there isn't. And then in green and blue and in white, we're looking at those places where it's too hot or too dry or too cold or too something for malaria, right? So naturally, we would expect malaria in both the red and the yellow areas. And historically, this holds up, right? So there's been malaria outbreaks as far north as Stockholm and even Murmansk, historically, right? Episodic, not endemic, but still, there's been malaria there. George Washington did not want Washington, D.C. to be built on the shores of the Potomac because of the malaria risk there. They did not listen and built D.C. in Foggy Bottom anyway, but that was a concern there, that area was malarious. And malaria was endemic on Sardinia and Sicily until late in the 1940s. So this holds up historically. Now, what is the key difference between the yellow and the red? The yellow areas are rich, the red areas are poor, right? Basically. And there are 3 reasons again for this. One is malaria medicine. So if you get malaria, you go to the doctor, you get medicine, and that makes sure that you don't fall too ill. You still get ill, you still feel pretty bad, but you won't die, right? So that is why you take the medicine. But if you take the medicine, that also means that you don't become infectious. So malaria is a complex disease, so the parasite needs to spend time in the human host, needs to then jump to a mosquito host, and then from the mosquito host jump back to a human. Otherwise the parasite will not survive. So if the human does not become infectious, because they all take medicine, you sort of you break the cycle and you create herd immunity, right? So that is one reason, malaria medicine. And malaria medicine is cheap, right? You're talking about 100 pounds per spell, right? Oh, that's nothing, right, for the NHS. It's an enormous sum of money in the Central African Republic, right? That is one reason. The second reason is environmental management. So as I said, mosquitoes need warm, still standing water to breathe in. So if you pave your roads, there's fewer potholes. If you pave your yards, you put proper roofs on your house, you reduce the habitat of the mosquito. If you drain your wetlands, you reduce the habitat of the mosquito, and that is exactly what we have done, right? So that is the second reason. And the third reason is clouds and clouds and clouds of DDT. DDT is a pretty nasty pesticide, kills everything, and we just spread and spread and spread. Southern Europe, the southern United States, Mexico, parts of Brazil are just covered in pesticide and killed loads and loads of mosquitoes. That program started at the end of World War II, lasted for 20 years almost. And then Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. And Silent Spring is all about the negative effects of DDT, particularly on bird life, right? He said that it will kill all the birds and there will be no bird song in spring, and therefore we're going to ban DDT, right? Which is what we did. And that stopped the spraying program before we reached Africa, before we reached northern Brazil, or southern Mexico for that matter. Is this southern Mexico? Bit unclear. Doesn't matter. Central America, right? So those are the big differences between the yellow and the red. Now what happens if we project this into the future? We have time on this axis. This is deliberately an older graph. So the projection starts in the year 2000. This was work that was done in the late 1990s. In blue, you're looking at what would happen to the incidence of malaria if climate is the only thing that changes. And what you see is that in the year 2000, around 70,000 people died of malaria or climate change-induced malaria. Around 500,000 people died, 70,000 of which were due to climate change. The number would have been 430,000 had the climate stayed in its pre-industrial condition. And then if the world gets warmer still, that goes up to around 250,000 people dying per year. If we then add population growth to the scenario, then we end up with 750,000 people dying per year, which is a pretty big number, right? Something to be concerned about. These dotted lines are the uncertainty about the malaria model. Now, if we go back to that world map and say, well, rich people don't die of no malaria, then we end up in the red line. We add economic growth to the picture. And then climate change is pushing malaria numbers up. Population growth is pushing malaria up. But better healthcare is pushing malaria down, right? And in this scenario, malaria sort of goes away around 2085 and everybody is rich enough to protect themselves. Now this is hugely uncertain. If you look at communist countries, for instance, they pay much more towards public health care than capitalist countries at an equal same development level. So if we impose that relationship, then things go away, malaria goes away much more quickly. Whereas if you look at public health spending in Africa, that's actually lagging behind what you would expect given their development level. And then you still sort of see the same qualitative pattern, but much, much more slowly, right? So this was work that was done in the 1990s, late 1990s. And at this time, Bill Gates stepped down from Microsoft and created the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And one of their priorities was to develop a malaria vaccine. And everybody thought he was completely nuts because the disease was too complicated that you just could not imagine developing a vaccine that would ever be effective. But this is a computer model that's doing things, so we said, let's stick this in, right, and see what happens. So they announced that they would need 2 decades to develop the vaccine. So that announcement was made around the year 2000, so that is why the model starts in 2020. We needed 20 years to roll out the polio vaccine across the world. So that is the 20 years that you see here. And if this medical breakthrough would be there, then the disease would go away, right? So now this tells you something about the enormous uncertainties in projecting the impacts of climate change, right? You need to understand climate change and population growth and the effects of economic growth. Can be very different, but you would also need to project technological progress, right? And very specific technological progress, not just some broad trend, things are getting better. No, a very specific medical intervention. Now, as I said, in the late 1990s, people thought that Bill Gates was completely nuts. But they were happy to take his money, right? I mean, medical doctors aren't stupid, right? If somebody says, I'm going to give you a big lab and hundreds of postdocs to work on something, then I think it's completely nuts. You're going to take the money and try to do something useful. Now, it turns out that this investment paid off, because what happened in 2017 was the first malaria vaccine was announced and approved. And a few weeks ago, the first effective malaria vaccine was rolled out and approved by the World Health Organization. So we're on this trajectory, right? This also tells you something about our ability to predict the future, right? Going back to the mule of Asimov, right? Bill Gates is the mule here. He did something that people thought impossible. Now, what happened really, more humility, what happened really to malaria numbers? In the model, they all went up. These are observations. Between 2000 and 2021, malaria actually came down. And the reason for this is George Bush, the younger. So what was supposed to be the legacy of Bush's presidency was not the invasion of Iraq, right? That was not what he had hoped to achieve when he entered the White House. His main policy priority was forgotten diseases, malaria, and did 2 things. One, reversed the ban on DDT. And DDT is now again allowed in small quantities when used to put on bed nets. And the other thing that they did was spread these bed nets all around Africa, find clever ways of getting it to people. And as a result, malaria numbers did not rise, as the model said, but actually fell. And there's a slight reversal. It has to do with COVID and so on and so forth at the end. So the model was completely wrong, right? Got the sign of the chains wrong. As well as the initial number, right? I said 500,000, but they found another 400,000 people dying of malaria. Which leads me to the final chapter, 2 minutes. I can do it in 2 minutes. Tom Schelling is a Nobel laureate, is a very naughty man. He asked 2 questions in the early 1990s. So most emissions of greenhouse gases come from rich countries, from rich people, and most of the consequences are suffered by poor people. So the first question he asked is, why do we care? We do not care about poor people per se. If you look at our trade policies, our immigration policies, our geopolitical policies, it does not reveal any particular care for people in Africa. If you look at Europe, right, there's so many people drown in the Mediterranean because of our immigration policies. That shows at face value that we actively hate them. We want them dead. But if now we turn around and we do climate policy, and all of a sudden we show all this care for the children and grandchildren of the people we obviously do not care about. And Schelling said, well, this is very peculiar, right? To care about the grandchildren of people you don't care about. He also asked the question, let's suspend our disbelief that we really do care about them. What is the best way of helping them, right? Or phrased differently, if vulnerability to climate change is so much driven by development, would we not help them grow economically and develop socially and politically? Would that not be a better way of reducing the impacts of climate change than greenhouse gas emission reduction? That question does not have an answer. It should be asked, but there is no proper answer. So if we think back to malaria, there the solution is pretty simple, right? If the choice is between cutting your greenhouse gases at great expense or investing in R&D to develop a vaccine, then the vaccine is much more effective. Doesn't just take away the climate change part of malaria, but takes away all malaria. So go for it, right? But recall that I also said that everybody thought Bill Gates was nuts, right? So in retrospect, this was a very smart investment. In prospect, this was money thrown away, right? The other example that I gave was, what is the problem with vulnerability in Bangladesh? Well, it's a rotten government. So the answer there is regime change, right? That is the way to solve vulnerability to sea level rise in Bangladesh. And regime change is something that we have some experience with. In some cases we did change the regime. Iraq, one example, Libya, one example. But you guys, I don't need to tell you, we did not necessarily change the regime for the better, right? In other places we tried to change the regime and completely failed. Syria being the prime example there. So there really, there is not something that we should decide, right? I actually am a believer in sovereignty, and I don't think we should go into other countries to change their regime. Even if we could, I don't think it's up to us, but different people have different opinions there, and that's perfectly respectable. But what we do know is that regime change is extremely hard to first establish and then change for the better. So if you're worried about sea level rise in Bangladesh, you can say, yeah, the answer is a better government. But for us sitting in England, this is not something that we can do. This is something that the Bangladeshis should sort out for themselves. The only thing we can do is cut our greenhouse gases, right? To reduce the severity of the problem. That's all for today.